My name's Christina Viviano, and I've been at the lab for about 9 years now. I'm in the space exploration sector in the planetary exploration group, and I'm excited to talk to you today about our evolving role at APL in the trajectory of Mars exploration and the strategies that the Mars community has been using to explore the red planet, and particularly the search for evidence of past life on Mars and potential habitats where life may have been able to take hold and thrive at some point in the past. So some of the first detailed images of Mars were transmitted back to Earth in the late 60s and 70s and revealed these ancient river canyons, huge extinct volcanoes, and massive canyon systems that suggested that Mars might have been much more Earth-like in the past. And as technologies improved, and orbiters with really high resolution cameras and spectrometers for identifying surface composition were launched in the late 90s and early 2000s and detected even more evidence for the interaction of water on the surface. And so around the same time, two Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, had reached the surface and discovered evidence for hydrothermal systems in these little spheres of iron oxides in a mineral called hematite that is shown in the rightmost image. And those are thought to form in the presence of water as well. So it was around this time that the Mars exploration program started to shift its focus from the mantra of follow the water to exploring habitability. And so on the heels of the start of those two Mars exploration rover missions, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, or MRO, was launched in 2005 with this unprecedented suite of orbital instruments in order to start to seek these new signs of ancient habitability on the surface. And with MRO, for the first time, we have these ultra high resolution images of the surface at a 0.5 meter per pixel scale with a high-rise camera. And synchronized with these images, we had, for the first time ever, 20 meter per pixel high resolution compositional imaging data from CRISM, the CRISM investigation. And CRISM, or the Compact Reconnaissance Imaging Spectrometer for Mars, was sort of dreamed up and built here at APL through the ingenuity and expertise of the scientists and engineers at our lab, under the leadership of the PI, Scott Murchie, who's seated at the center of the picture. And in 2006, it successfully went into orbit around Mars, and the MRO mission and CRISM are still actually operating today. So over these past 15 years, CRISM has left this extraordinarily rich legacy of exploration of the Martian surface from orbit and reconnaissance for identifying these key regions on the surface to explore with ground operations. And so how does this instrument actually detect surface composition? Well, as MRO orbits Mars, the CRISM instrument is commanded and scheduled by someone at APL on our science operation team to point down towards the surface at a specific target that we wish to observe. And as the sunlight sort of shines down on the surface and reflects off, eventually those photons reach the CRISM detector in orbit. And if we look closely at what is actually happening at the molecular level, we would see that when the light hits the surface, it's actually interacting with molecules that make up the minerals that are in these rocks. And these minerals are naturally occurring compounds that are made up of microscopic structures of atoms like oxygen, silicon, iron, hydrogen, and they're all bonded together. And so when the sunlight reflects off the surface, it's actually interacting with these atoms and the bonds between them. And the energy from the light makes these bonds in the mineral structure begin to vibrate. And they vibrate at different frequencies, some faster, some slower, depending on the bonds and the size of the atoms in the compound. And that means that there's some transfer of that energy from the light into the mineral structure. And that transfer of energy causes these vibrations to heat up the rock. And so instead of receiving all of the light back from the sun to the detector, some very specific energy frequencies or wavelengths are actually missing. And because these very specific frequencies of light have been absorbed into the vibrations, they're now heating the surface. And so these specific absorption features in the spectrum measured by CRISM, which is shown in the red here, can be compared to samples that we have measured in the lab on Earth. And we light up these lab samples and identify the key positions of the absorption features related to the lab samples so that we can then interpret the CRISM spectrum. So in this case, the CRISM spectrum matches well with an iron-bearing clay or mud-like mineral that was measured in the lab. And so because each pixel in a CRISM image, which you're seeing here, is made up of one of these spectra, the images are extremely information dense. And so to simplify this, we use these specific parameterizations of each image to sort of reflect that variability in the position of the absorption features. So in this case, the specific way that the colors are displayed here reflects the absorptions at specific positions and therefore known minerals. And so over the past 15 years, CRISM has identified widespread evidence for minerals that are hydrated or have water or OH inside of them. And these indicate that the rock has interacted with water at some point in the past. And so we found these minerals in a variety of settings that tell us about the past climate conditions on the planet. So for example, on Earth, one way that clay minerals are formed is through a common soil forming process where long-term exposure of rocks at the surface to rainfall causes leaching of more soluble cations in the soil and stratification that results from the altered minerals in the soils. So where we commonly see more aluminum clays, oxides and silica in the overlying layer, and then iron and magnesium clay in the lower layers. And so when we use CRISM high resolution imaging to investigate the fine details of these hydrated units on Mars, the more we look at these, the more we see the same type of sequence where we have aluminum clay overlying iron magnesium clay, suggesting that rainfall or top-down fluid flow created the signature of leaching, these soil-like clay horizons on Mars. And so CRISM also has a lower spatial resolution mapping mode that has very impressive coverage of the surface. And these images show us that this sort of top-down soil signature has occurred on a broad scale, a regional scale, suggesting that rainfall occurred over large regions of the planet. And in this image, the strength of the absorption related to that iron clay is shown in the warmer colors. So in terms of the Mars perspective, CRISM has fundamentally contributed to an evolving view of Mars's past because we've identified over 25 unique minerals indicative of water with variable chemistries in countless types of diverse settings where habitable environments were once present. And so because of that, the Mars exploration program strategy shifted again from a focus on exploring habitability to seeking signs of life. And one of these locations where habitable environments were identified from orbit is Gale Crater. And this location is an enormous layered stack of sediments inside a large crater, thought at one time to be filled with water, kind of like a lake. And from CRISM, we observed olivine-rich sands in the crater floor and a sequence of clay-rich layers at the bottom of the stack. And then on top of that, these sulfate salt-rich layers. And clays commonly form in more neutral waters where sulfate salts indicate a drier climate where evaporation and salt precipitation is occurring. So this transition in the layers of the rocks signifies a transition in the environment. And so interestingly, we also observed this ridge of, with the signature of hematite, or that iron oxide. And on Earth, iron oxidation and reduction are often catalyzed by microbes. So because of the combination of the compositional information recorded in these layers and the Hematite Ridge, Gale Crater became this sort of tantalizing location to explore in more detail. So because of this, the Mars community selected Gale Crater as the landing site for the Mars Curiosity rover. And Curiosity, which is shown here, is a vehicle about the size of a small SUV, and it's equipped with these laboratory-grade instruments chosen to measure in detail the evidence for habitability in these rocks. And after landing on the floor of Gale Crater in 2012, Curiosity began to approach the layered mound at the center of Gale. And the minerals that were observed from orbit, including the olivine-rich sands, the lower clay-bearing unit, and the upper sulfate salts, started coming into view as Curiosity made this traverse. And so as it began to ascend this mound of layered rocks, it would periodically drill and sample powders of these rocks, detecting varying amounts of hematite, clay, and these sulfate salts. And interestingly, this strong hematite signature that was identified from orbit with CRISM lined up with these regions where less sand and dust were obscuring the hematite on the ground. And so the pink pixels in the upper left image indicate where CRISM identified hematite. And then these stars are the locations where Curiosity measured larger amounts of hematite abundance in the rock. And when we tie in the ground results from Curiosity, we found that the hematite-bearing ridge, later named Vera Rubin Ridge, was even more interesting and kind of complex than originally thought from orbit. This location shows a part of the ridge where the dust has been brushed off by the rover to reveal a gray color of the rocks beneath. And so these rocks have hematite in them, and in this case, gray hematite. And they provide evidence that the waters in this area were actually probably warm and longer lived, given how we know gray hematite forms on Earth. And then these cross-cutting bright material in the rock would have formed after the rocks were buried. And so underground waters flowing through the rocks would have precipitated the bright minerals. So both the gray hematite and the bright cross-cutting minerals tell us that the rock experienced a long and variable period of habitability and interaction with water, both at the surface and in the subsurface once it was buried. So probably one of the most exciting discoveries that CRISM made was the detection of carbonate from orbit. And on Earth, carbonate records precipitation from neutral waters that may have been more habitable to life. And for instance, limestone, which is a pretty well-known rock here on Earth, is made of carbonate and often contains abundant fossils that record past life on Earth. So it was a pretty exciting find to see this carbonate from orbit. And in the case of Jezero Crater, these carbonates were identified in association with this ancient delta deposit. And on the right, you can see that an active delta from Alaska, where the sediments are flowing down a channel and emptying into a standing body of water, where the delta forms. And so when we see a delta on Mars, we can infer that there was once standing water. And so this is an artist's rendition of what Jezero Crater might have looked like in the past. And so once again, the spectacular minerals observed from CRISM led the Mars community of scientists to determine that Jezero Crater would be the next landing site for the next Mars mission, Mars 2020, or the Perseverance rover. And so it landed just this last February, and it's begun its drive towards the delta, where it will sample rocks that and eventually make its way up and out of the crater. So what sets Perseverance aside from or apart from the previous rovers is that it's actually part of a long-term objective to collect samples that will eventually be brought back to Earth. And it's the first of a 3-mission concept of a multinational mission concept to return samples to Earth as soon as the early 2030s. And so while later stages of Mars sample return are still sort of being solidified, Perseverance plan is to drill and sample over 30 rocks and leave them as a cache on the surface for delivery back to Earth. So APL and the efforts from the CRISM investigation have sort of directly fed into this landing site selection and the samples that the Perseverance rover will retrieve and eventually become the first samples of Mars to be collected and returned to Earth. So when Perseverance landed in February, it was about several kilometers away from the main delta formation, which is in the upper left. And it began sort of skirting around this yellow region that CRISM tells us has the signature for olivine. And it drove into this yellow region maybe about a month ago. And on September 6th, the rover had its first successful drilling and sampling of a rock in this area called Rochette. This sample was put into a titanium sample tube on board Perseverance. And the GIF on the right shows an image of that drill core in the tube and then the tube being sealed. And so as the rover continues driving, the science and operation teams plan to sample that carbonate unit and the rocks that are in the delta that may have concentrated and preserved ancient organic matter. So when it landed, Perseverance also imaged a nearby remnant, a eroded remnant of that main delta formation with very high resolution cameras that are on board Perseverance. And the first science paper out of this mission, which includes authors from our group at APL, just came out and highlights the ground evidence and confirmation of that delta, which was observed from orbit. So as Perseverance continues its path towards the delta, the CRISM investigation will again directly feed into those samples that Perseverance will retrieve and eventually become the first samples collected from Mars and returned to Earth. And the carbonates discovered by CRISM from orbit will be an exciting sample that will be returned and investigated for any preserved signs of ancient life. So we have a robust kind of group of Mars experts at APL who continue to be involved as science investigators and team members of many missions that have gone to Mars and will continue to go. And our group also uses data from these missions and laboratory facilities on site at APL to perform complex and innovative research that will continue to set this course of Mars exploration for the future. So I just wanted to finish with some of the many faces that are currently working on Mars at APL, including the principal investigator of the CRISM mission, Scott Murchie, and many who helped keep the CRISM investigation going, as well as folks at APL who are involved in the Curiosity and Perseverance rover missions that I highlighted here today. Thank you.